July 2022. A president sneaks out of his own official residence in the middle of the night, boards a military jet, and disappears from his own country. Not because of a war. Not because of a coup. Because the money ran out. That's it. That's the whole story, for now. Keep that image in your head, because by the time this video is over, you'll understand exactly how a country gets to that point. And trust me, it's a lot dumber and a lot scarier than you think. The one rule: every collapse breaks. Every national collapse in modern history starts the exact same boring way. A government spends more money than it collects, year after year, and quietly borrows the difference. On its own, this isn't dramatic. Almost every country does it. Your own government probably does it right now, and nobody's fleeing the country over it. The danger shows up when the gap keeps growing and the borrowing keeps compounding, especially when that borrowing is in a currency the government doesn't actually control, like the US dollar. This is exactly where our fleeing president's country began its slide: Sri Lanka. Through the 2010s, the government poured borrowed money, a lot of it in foreign currency, into massive infrastructure projects. Highways, ports. An airport so empty that critics nicknamed it the world's emptiest international airport, which is a truly impressive achievement for an airport. The debt kept climbing, but as long as new loans kept arriving, nobody outside a few nervous economists cared. The shock that breaks the piggy bank. A country can often limp along like this for years, right up until a shock hits, and its income collapses faster than anyone can cut spending to match. For Sri Lanka, the shocks arrived in a grim little parade. In 2019, a coordinated terror attack on churches and hotels devastated the tourism industry overnight, one of the country's biggest sources of foreign cash. Then the government slashed taxes dramatically, which is a bit like deciding to renovate your kitchen the same month you got laid off. Then COVID-19 arrived and finished off tourism completely. Then, in a decision that still makes economists wince, the government banned imported fertilizer and forced a sudden nationwide switch to organic farming, supposedly to save foreign currency. Crop yields collapsed instead, and the country ended up importing even more food than before. Any one of these might have been survivable. All four stacked together were not. 2 decades earlier, Zimbabwe's shock was almost entirely self-inflicted. A land redistribution program that gutted commercial agriculture, wiping out the export earnings the country needed to buy fuel and medicine from abroad. Nobody bombed Zimbabwe's economy. Zimbabwe did it themselves, with paperwork. The two worst options in economics. Here's the part most people never learn. Once a government hits this wall, it has exactly 2 options left, and both are terrible. Option 1. Print more of its own money to cover the gap. This is what Zimbabwe chose. Printing money doesn't create real wealth. It just creates more currency chasing the same shrinking pile of goods. Flood a shrinking economy with new cash and prices don't just rise, they go feral. By November 2008, Zimbabwe's monthly inflation rate hit an estimated 79.6 billion%. Prices were doubling roughly every 24 hours. The government kept lopping zeros off the currency and printing bigger notes just to keep pace, eventually releasing a $100 trillion banknote that, at its worst, could barely cover a bus fare. Zimbabweans started carrying cash in wheelbarrows, not as a joke, but because a wallet genuinely could not hold enough of it. Option 2. Keep borrowing in foreign currency until literally nobody on earth will lend to you anymore. This is what Sri Lanka chose. And here's the trap that makes this option so cruel. If you owe money in US dollars, you cannot simply print more dollars to pay it off. Only the US can do that. You can only print your own currency, and foreign creditors have zero interest in being paid back in monopoly money. By early 2022, Sri Lanka's foreign currency reserves had fallen below $2 billion, while the country owed over $4 billion in repayments that same year. The money to pay didn't exist, and there was no legal spell to conjure it into existence. Both roads dead-end in the same place. A government with nothing left to offer. The currency dies, quietly at first. Whichever road a country takes, what happens next looks almost identical. The national currency starts losing real value, sometimes within days. Sri Lanka's rupee lost roughly a third of its value in a single month at the peak of the crisis. In Zimbabwe, a currency's collapse was so total that a comfortable retirement fund could evaporate into nothing within months, turning careful, disciplined savers into accidental paupers overnight, through no fault of their own. This is usually also the point where a government formally admits defeat and defaults, announcing it simply cannot pay what it owes. On April 12, 2022, Sri Lanka did exactly that. It stopped paying its foreign debts entirely, on around $51 billion owed, the first sovereign default in the country's history as an independent nation. When the economy becomes personal. This is the part most economics explainers skip past, and it's the part that actually matters. No foreign currency means no imports, and most countries import fuel, medicine, and often food. In Sri Lanka, cars queued for literal days outside gas stations. Hospitals rationed power through rolling blackouts, trying to keep life-saving equipment running on fumes. Cooking gas vanished from homes nationwide. Inflation soared past 65%, meaning a paycheck that covered groceries in January might barely cover half of them by March. In Zimbabwe, roughly 8 out of every 10 working-age citizens found themselves without formal jobs. People went back to bartering eggs for haircuts, maize for school fees, because the cash in their pockets had become an elaborate paper prop. This is the moment a currency collapse stops being an abstract number on a finance channel and becomes somebody's grandmother rationing her heart medication. The streets answer back. Eventually, public patience runs out roughly at the same rate the currency does. In Sri Lanka, hundreds of thousands of ordinary citizens, teachers, students, shop owners, poured into the streets in the largest protest the country had seen in generations. Protesters eventually broke into the presidential residence itself. And that brings us back to where we started. In July 2022, with his own citizens now inside his front gates, the president fled the country by military jet, resigning shortly after from exile. He didn't lose an election. He didn't lose a war. He lost the argument that the money was ever going to come back, and everybody in the country had already worked that out before he did. This pattern is almost eerily consistent. When a currency or debt crisis gets bad enough, leadership rarely survives it intact. The rescue that hurts too. Eventually, a broken government crawls to the International Monetary Fund, an organization created specifically to be the world's emergency lender of last resort. The rescue always comes with strings attached. Raise taxes, cut spending, remove subsidies that have been keeping fuel and food artificially cheap. These are, of course, exactly the moves that hurt ordinary people the most, at the exact moment they can least afford it. It's one of the cruelest little jokes in economics. The medicine that fixes an economy over the long run often makes life harder for the very people who are already suffering the most. Sri Lanka's rescue also meant separate, painstaking negotiations with China, India, Japan, and a tangle of private bondholders, each with their own agenda and their own patience level, stretching the process out for years. Zimbabwe, for its part, had to abandon its own currency entirely in 2009, adopting the US dollar just to convince people that money could be trusted again. And even that didn't stick. In 2019, Zimbabwe reintroduced a local currency, and within months, inflation was roaring back. The country has now burned through 6 different currencies in under 2 decades, which is either a remarkable case study in persistence or the financial equivalent of touching the same hot stove 6 times. So what actually happens? Put the whole chain together, and it looks like this. A government overspends and borrows too much, often in a currency it doesn't control. A shock hits, and its income collapses. With nowhere good left to turn, it either prints money it doesn't have or keeps borrowing until nobody will lend anymore. The currency loses real value, sometimes within days. Fuel, medicine, and food start disappearing for daily life. The public turns on its leaders, and leadership often doesn't survive. And finally, a slow, painful recovery begins, usually on someone else's terms. That's the real answer. It's never one dramatic moment. It's a chain reaction, and once it starts moving, it is brutally difficult to stop. And this isn't ancient history. or a problem confined to two unlucky countries. Lebanon's currency has lost over 90% of its value since 2019. Venezuela's economy has shrunk by more than half amid its own hyperinflation spiral. Argentina has ridden this exact roller coaster more times than most Argentines would probably like to count. And right now, with many governments around the world carrying historically high levels of debt, more than a few economists are quietly running the numbers on which country walks the same path next. If this kind of deep dive is what you're here for, make sure you're subscribed to Comb Explains, because we're going to keep pulling back the curtain on how the world's economy actually works, the parts nobody explains to you in school. Drop a comment below. Which country do you think is closest to becoming the next case study? I read every single one, and it might just become our next video. I am Comb. This has been Comb Explains. I'll see you in the next one.